the methamphetamine definitely hit the scene very hard. It was very popular in LGBTQ community. Hello everybody, my name is Pej. I'm an interventionist that specializes in helping people with drug addiction, alcoholism, and mental health. Today I want to talk about the evolution of drug addiction and what it's looked like, let's say, in just the last 50 years. I'm 51 years old. I am a former drug addict, former alcoholic, so I have a lot of experience with this. I can tell you what I had learned when I was much younger, what I'd seen from personal experience, self-disclosure, and what I've seen more recently in the last decade or decade and a half. I am 15 and a half years sober too. So this is what I wanted to say. So obviously, in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 1970s, drug addiction looked a certain way. There was a lot of hallucinogens. There was a lot of, obviously, marijuana usage. There was heroin use. There was opium use. And then there's, the big macaroni, the cocaine. Meth had barely, it definitely was around. They would call them crosstops or various other types of stimulants. Meth was definitely used in wars. It was used in Europe. It was distributed worldwide, but more, it kind of more made its way into the scene, I believe, in the US, like into the 70s and 80s. Now, heroin addiction has been going on for a long, long time, right? But what I noticed was that heroin addiction was really, really popular in the 70s and 80s. I myself first started using drugs in the 80s. I was very young. I was 12 years old. It started with marijuana addiction, and then later on it went into other types of things like hallucinogens and then cocaine addiction and things like that. Now, one of the reasons that I used was because of certain traumas that I had. I wanted to mask my emotions and not have to feel. So, and then also there was also that experimental phase, obviously, when I was super young. There was people around me that I was influenced by, and some of them were doing certain things like marijuana, but some were getting into some heavier stuff like hallucinogens and cocaine. That was like around 16 years of age. And then throughout time, I had my different stints of using opiates like heroin, which back in the day on the West Coast was black tar heroin. On the East Coast was more China white. Two different structures, two different styles of using. Although you can use them intravenously, you can snort them or you could smoke them. So there was many different ways that heroin could be used, but it wasn't really popular, at least not in my circles in my era, which was more the 80s and the 90s. During that time, ecstasy had hit the scene. Hallucinogens was something that we were experimenting with more in our later adolescent years, around 16, 17, and 18. And then, during the 90s, there was the EDM scene. There was definitely a lot of electronic music, clubbing type of drugs that were very popular, such as ecstasy, such as GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate. We were using these a lot during that time. And then, the methamphetamine definitely hit the scene very hard. It was very popular in LGBTQ community. It was also very popular in the biker community. There was a lot of crank and crystal meth that we were trying when I was, around 17, 18 years old. This stuff was extremely powerful, extremely potent. It would keep you up for days and days, and sometimes you would have psychotic breaks, and sometimes you would, just want to experiment and do all kinds of things, build things, expand your mind and try to fix things, if you will. So right around the mid-90s, I remember that I would see certain friends of mine that were using buddies that were getting into using heroin. And during that time, the oxys started hitting the scene. This was like probably more late 90s, early 2000s. There was OxyContin, there was the 80 milligrams. They were medical grade. People would get their hands on them. A lot of heroin addicts would like to they were able to break it down and intravenously use it. It was highly potent, highly strong. It was basically medical grade heroin. And then if they couldn't get that, then they would just go directly to heroin. I had started to experience just one or two friends that had overdosed and actually died from it. One was my roommate. And I myself I'd already had my heroin stint. I got into opium. Being a Persian man, opium was easily attainable through certain people. And when I would use it, I found myself seeking a head high, but having more of a body high, and then becoming very dependent upon it to the point where I experienced withdrawals. I became dope sick. And I never wanted to feel like that again. It was like having the worst flu that I've ever had. I was shivering, I was shaking, and so I made a vow within myself never to do that again. I had quit doing meth. I was doing meth for a while. I'd quit doing meth for a while. Back then we called it crystal and crank. Later on, after quitting for a while, I somehow got back into it because of certain people I was around. But at that point, it was called glass. It was more of a smokable form of meth. It looked more like shards and diamonds. And when I would do it, again, I felt that euphoria. My heartbeat was rapid. I was constantly trying to fix things, constantly on missions. I was up for days and days. And, over a period of time from smoking a meth or just the glass that was out there, I could even sleep easily and I could sometimes even eat. So it was having a different effect on me as opposed to the old school crank that I was using. Now I was doing it with some people and noticing that some of them would use the same amount as me and they would experience psychosis. Now, I personally never actually experienced psychosis to the point where I would hear voices or have, schizophrenia or drug-induced psychosis as a result of doing this stuff, but I would see people I was using with start to actually question me, question the walls, think that people were out to get them, and then, I decided my life wasn't working for me. Between 30 and 35 years of age, after selling drugs extensively, I became my own worst and best customer. I pretty much had pushed everybody away from me. I had become a homeless man, and by the time I was 35 years old, I decided to seek help. When I got help, I ended up changing my whole life, transforming, getting sober, going to school, and learning. I wanted to become a drug and alcohol counselor, so I would go to pharmacology classes and learn about the evolution of drugs. And I would, during that time, also start working in treatment. And I noticed that the Oxy 80s were no longer available the way that they were, and people were doing Roxys, which they were the M30s, and a lot of people were, figuring out ways of abusing that too. And then fentanyl started to hit the scene. And, fentanyl had already been around for a long time. It was more used in, like a medical setting for surgeries and things like that. But, in like probably 2009 or 2010, we started to see it being prescribed to people. And so people would be getting it as a patch or as lollipops, fentanyl lollipops. It was for pain. Solely it was made for pain. It was like the strongest opiate that was out there. And people that were abusing fentanyl would open the patch and use it in different ways. Some of them would shoot it, some of them would snort it and whatnot. But that's when I first started to see fentanyl. So, the evolution of fentanyl in the last, let's say between 2010 and right now it's 2022, almost 2023, I have seen it evolve into other types of, fentanyl. It's not like it's just, there's pressed pills, definitely. There's blues, they look like M30s, but these are counterfeit pills. There is a lot of it being distributed from outside of our country. Some of it's being made in places like China, and then obviously, the cartels and them definitely get it distributed into the United States. These days, the type of addicts that I see as opposed to the type of addicts that I used to see back when I was, in the 80s and 90s, there's a lot more people that are becoming dependent upon opiates, a lot of fentanyl addicts, and a lot more overdoses. Like we did see lots of heroin overdoses throughout the late 90s to 2000s, but more recently into the 2010s and 2020s, we see a lot of people that are using fentanyl solely because they love the effect that's produced by it, how powerful it is. And so right now we are seeing a different type of addict that are out there that are addicted to this stuff. On a national basis, there are a lot of people that are contacting me and they're telling me that, all walks of life, all ages, they are using the blues, which they know are fentanyl, but they're also using powdered and rock form of fentanyl. So if you are somebody that you know is struggling with any type of drug addiction, you can always call me at 310-596-9356. My name is Pej. I'm the interventionist.